Hi everyone, welcome to the second lesson of Module 3, where we're asking the question, how do I bundle my performance expectations to create NGSS units? Our learning objective says, I can bundle performance expectations by domain and or by theme in order to create a unit. Really important to acknowledge this lesson is not an exhaustive explanation of creating an NGSS unit. Rather, we're going to focus primarily on the first step in creating an NGSS unit, which is bundling or grouping or choosing which performance expectations you are going to be focusing on in a particular unit. Table of contents, you should have already posted on the discussion board with those graphics related to NGSS storylines. Right now you're watching the video, then you're going to post on the Padlet and explore some unit planning resources. So as you saw on the discussion board that you posted on, NGSS units are often referred to as storylines. A storyline is a coherent sequence of lessons in which each step is driven by students' questions that arise from their interactions with phenomena. So I think the key words in that definition are a coherent sequence, right? One activity or investigation leads to the next, which leads to the next, which leads to the next. I think the other important part is that it's always arising out of students' interactions with phenomena. So both the anchoring phenomenon and also the investigatory phenomena along the way. You saw these two graphics. The first graphic is from OpenSciEd. OpenSciEd bases their instructional model and their unit design around 5 main routines, which you can read about later in this lesson if you choose. The first one's an anchoring phenomenon routine where students share an experience and then create a driving question board with all their questions about the phenomenon. Goes to the navigation routine where the class figures out where do we go from here, which leads to investigation, which leads to putting the pieces back together, making sense of what they know so far, which leads to problematizing, which means identifying the questions that are emerging from the activities they've done so far, which then leads to investigation, et cetera, right? All around trying to understand that anchoring phenomenon. With this graphic, you saw it might be this graphic might have been helpful for some of you, right? Where it starts with an anchoring phenomenon, which leads to a driving question, which leads to a bunch of phenomenon level questions, right? Where you have a different phenomenon, where you're answering a question about that, engaging in an SCP. Every time when you do this, you're coming back to this initial model and revising that model until eventually at the end of the unit, you revisit the driving question and develop a final consensus model for the class about the anchoring phenomenon, right? So I think both of these kind of two graphics, you can see how it's coherent. It's a sequence that builds off each other, driven by student questions, and it's all based around that phenomena. So a review from previous lessons. As we've said before, NGSS units should reflect student-driven inquiry with the teacher as the guide. NGSS units should be driven by an anchoring phenomenon. NGSS units won't necessarily follow a linear progression. They should be working towards a three-dimensional assessment about a novel phenomenon, and they should include significant instruction around SEPs, science engineering practices, and CCC's cross-cutting concepts. So let's get started. So later on in this lesson, like I said, you're going to explore some unit planning resources. And here are a couple of them. This one is from wonderofscience.com, right? It's a step-by-step process to design your own NGSS storyline. But I think really important to realize the first step is bundling performance expectations, choosing which PEs you are going to include in a given unit. Here's another graphic from ngsstorylines.com, which you'll explore later as well, where you can see the steps in order to create a storyline. But once again, it starts with this first one. You got to choose which PEs you're going to teach in order to design a unit around them, right? So that's what we're going to mainly talk about today is how do you bundle, what are the options of ways you can bundle your performance expectations? So in case some people might not know this, all performance expectations begin with an abbreviation that indicates the domain they're a part of, right? So all NGSS standards, all of them start with one of three definitions. Either they start with PS, LS, or ESS. PS standards are physical science standards, LS are life science, and ESS are earth space science, right? So here's some examples from the first grade curriculum. One, PS 4-1 is a physical science standard, LS life science standard, and ESS earth space science standard. So when it comes to bundling your PEs, it's often most natural and maybe easiest to bundle your PEs by domain, right? So you're going to teach a unit, an Earth Space Science unit, right? So all the Earth Space Science standards that you teach, you're going to lump them together and create a unit around it. Or same for LS or PS. The purpose of this video is for you to reflect on whether or not that necessarily is the best way to group your PEs, and other ways you could group your PEs instead. So we're going to break it down into two main ways to bundle your PEs. One is by domain, and the other is by theme. So by domain is what we were just talking about, grouping PEs based on their domain, right? So all the PS, all the LS, and all the ESS in separate units, teaching those. And versus by theme, which is grouping your PEs across domains, right? In one unit, you teach both a PS performance expectation as well as an ESS performance expectation. Super important, though, I want to point out, though, is that I also said, instead of just by domain, it also says and or by core idea or and or across core ideas. The reason I say that is because some of you who are watching this video teach and this doesn't apply if you're a kindergarten through 5 teacher, right? If you're kindergarten through 5, you have ESS, PS, and LS standards that are already part of what you're supposed to teach, right? However, chances are, if you're a high school teacher watching this, you probably teach a course that's domain specific, right? So it's, for example, I teach high school biology. All of my PEs are life science PEs. So when I say by domain, for you guys, I want you to think about within one core idea. So within, like, you're teaching a unit, if you're domain specific, you're teaching a unit where all the standards fall within the core idea of molecules to organisms. Whereas when you think thematic, then you're thinking about how you could create a unit that includes PEs from both this core idea, molecules to organisms, and let's say this core idea, ecosystems, right? So that's how it kind of applies to you all. There is a lot of research around the benefits of integrating or not just having domain-specific courses for students in middle school and high school, that if you want me to share with you at some point, feel free to email me. But I realize the reality is most of us probably work in settings in the secondary environment or might work in settings in the secondary environment where we are domain-specific. So hopefully that clears that up a little bit. So what does this look like? What does this look like in practice? Okay, so if you group PEs by domain, maybe this means that you teach astronomy and you teach it very conceptually. And then you have a unit about gravity and forces, and those two things are taught in different units. So you have an ESS unit and a PS unit, right? Whereas if you teach it by theme, astronomy is taught in conjunction with gravity and forces. The connections and applications of physics are then applied to astronomy. So you have a unit that's comprised of two domains, ESS and PS domains. Another example, by domain, heat is taught as a separate physics unit, climate and weather is taught as a separate physics unit. Whereas if you do it by theme, heat or physics is taught at the same time using climate and weather as the applied examples. So right, in one unit you have PS and an ESS. One more example, light is taught as a separate unit, PS as strictly physics with no connection to life science needed, whereas by theme would look like light and the chemistry of photosynthesis are all taught in an interconnected presentation, which would be a unit comprised of PS standards and LS standards. So what are the benefits of these two options? So if you bundle your PEs by domain, it results in learning that is mostly domain specific, right? So here we're going to have a life science unit, kids. We're going to learn about life science, right? Whereas by theme, it enables learning about the natural connections between the various domains, which hopefully makes you think of the cross-cutting concepts, right? That's what cross-cutting concepts are, right? Ways in which concepts or themes which cut across various domains of science, right? So it enables learning about those natural connections between, let's say, looking at the previous example, physical science and earth space science. If you do by domain, connections often have to be remembered by the student and the teacher. For example, you did a life science unit to start the year, and now you're on a physical science unit, and you're like, oh guys, this physical science, is this what we're learning about? Remember how like way back when we did that unit on life science, and we learned about this and this and this? That applies here too, right? So you're like looking back to remember those connections. Whereas if you organize your PEs by theme, generally those connections between science domains are clearly made for students and by students, right? Students are more easily able to see those connections and make those connections themselves, as opposed to having to remember back to when you did something previously. When you do it by domain, examples within a particular domain are normally given, whereas by theme, examples outside of a particular domain are more easily given when appropriate. And I think it's also important to notice, like, where does engineering fit into this? It's often a question we get as far as, like, should I teach a separate engineering design unit, right? We haven't talked much about it in this course, but engineering does have its own little set of standards within NGSS. And I want to make really clear, like, engineering design is already integrated into certain performance expectations. I give you an example here of a first grade performance expectation where students are using materials to design a solution to a human problem, right? This is an engineering focus of this inquiry. And so engineering design should always be taught through the lens of particular content. It should never be taught isolated in its own quote-unquote engineering domain. It should always be taught through the lens of a particular content or particular domain, like life science or science or physical science. All right, so that's just a little bit kind of like a tidbit. Okay, so two different ways to group your standards, your performance expectations. However, I want to acknowledge a couple things here. One, some of us don't get to make the decision about how our PEs are bundled, right? Some of us, for whatever reason in our context, right, we're entering a context where we're on a team of 6 other teachers and the units have already been chosen. So, right, so even if you want to do a different unit, it's not an option, right? So you don't have the opportunity to group your PEs. Or there are lots of other factors, right, that could affect maybe a higher up admin is telling you this is the unit you must teach, right? So not all of us have the freedom to bundle our PEs. However, even if that's you, I think it's still important to recognize how your PEs are bundled in a particular unit, right? It helps you understand what you'll be teaching, and also understand the challenges. Perhaps if you're not, let's say you're teaching by domain specific in a domain specific way, the challenges you're gonna face as far as making connections with other domains, as well as the benefits potentially of how you bundled your expectations, right? Maybe what things are going to be more clear, what things are going to be more challenging to explain, or whatnot. It's important to recognize how the PEs in your particular units are being bundled, even if you can't make that decision yourself. Also important to recognize that how you bundle your PEs often depends on the phenomenon you've chosen, right? So some people might even say it's better to choose your phenomenon and then find which PEs would best support that phenomenon, right? Sometimes it can be really difficult to find a phenomenon that crosses domains, and that's also a reality that affects how you bundle your PEs. Flexibility is key here, right? So it's possible the first year or two you teach your NGSS standards, you're gonna group them by domain. I think it's important to maintain some level of flexibility in your learning as you become more familiar with the performance expectations, to be willing to incorporate PEs from other domains in order to enhance that cross-domain learning that your students are doing. And last but not least, familiarity with your PEs is crucial. I think this is probably something like a common theme you're getting out of this entire course, is that to teach NGSS, you gotta understand your performance expectations that you're being tasked with teaching. You gotta look at those evidence statements, understand how the cross-cutting concept informs the way you're instructing it. Understand how to do these SEPs so you can teach them to students. That totally applies to bundling your PEs and creating a coherent NGSS storyline as well. So what you're going to do now is you are going to access the PEs associated with your grade level or course, and I'll post this on Google Classroom. My favorite way to access performance expectations is through the Wonder of Science website, which I already did, right, where you can see if you're a first grade teacher. It's not loading right now, it's actually right here. If you're a first grade teacher, you can see these. If you click these 3 things, you'll find all of your PEs. Just for the sake of exercise, I want you to find 2 PEs from different domains that you could bundle together as part of one unit. And on the Padlet, share which 2 PEs you chose and how they could relate thematically in a unit. Remember that you're not committing to teaching these together, but just be thinking about it and try to think of a way they could connect, right? So here's an example of what a post on the job like Padlet could look like, so feel free to check that out. Remember, if you teach a course that is domain specific, like let's say you teach middle school earth science or you teach high school physics, in your case on that job like Padlet, please go ahead and, let's say you're middle school earth science, choose 2 PEs that come from 2 separate core ideas underneath this domain, right, on that job like Padlet. After you post on the job like Padlet, you're going to have access to some unit design resources, 3 main resources, one from OpenSciEd, where you're going to learn more about those 5 routines, one from the Wonder of Science, which walks you through the storyline design process and includes a template with some example storylines, and then another one from ngsstorylines.org, that'll include a bunch of tools for creating storylines. Thank you to Tri Association for making this course possible. Feel free to reach out with any questions you have as you complete the rest of the activities in this module. Thanks.